Before we begin tonight's spy story, take a moment to like this video and follow the channel. Your support helps these nightly missions continue, and it means more than you know. In the stillness of a city that had barely begun to stir, a young man drifted through the narrow streets like a quiet thread weaving itself between the waking buildings. It was the hour before dawn, when the world holds its breath, when the hum of street lamps seems louder than the distant roads, and when the few windows that glow do so with only the faintest traces of human life. In that fragile moment between night and morning, he felt most at ease. He walked with a softness that belonged to someone who had learned to move without drawing attention. Steps measured, posture calm, every motion shaped by an instinctive awareness of the world around him. Even then, long before anyone knew his name, there was something deliberate in the way he crossed a street or paused at a corner, as though he recognized the unseen rhythm of the city and chose to follow it rather than break it. This young man would one day be known as Agent Zigzag, a name born not from glory or recognition, but from the intricate, unpredictable path he would navigate through the shadows of history. His real identity, the one he carried through these silent streets, would fade long before newspapers, archives, and whispered conversations ever spoke of him. But every story, even one destined to unravel in secrecy, begins somewhere. And his began quietly, with a single person noticing him just long enough to wonder who he really was. It happened on an early morning much like any other, one of those quiet hours when the world feels suspended between sleep and waking. The city was only just beginning to brighten, its buildings turning from silhouettes into shapes as the colors of dawn slowly brushed the sky. At the far end of a nearly empty street, a lone car rested in the shadow of an overhanging tree. Its engine was cold, its windows slightly misted, as if it had been waiting there far longer than anyone would expect at such an hour. Inside, a man sat perfectly still. He leaned forward just slightly, elbows resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on a single figure emerging from the pale morning light. A young runner, moving with a steady pace, breath visible in the cold air. The man watched him intently, not with suspicion, not with fear or concern, but with something quieter, something heavier. Recognition, as though he was witnessing a memory rather than a stranger jogging past. For weeks that followed, the silent observer returned to the same vantage point. Day after day, he studied the young man's early routine, the routes he chose, the rhythm he kept, the subtle way he responded to his surroundings. The runner never looked over his shoulder without reason. He never paused unless something caught his attention. Even the smallest disruption, a loose grate, a sudden gust of wind, a car door closing a street away, made him shift his path without breaking stride. They were traits too deliberate, too instinctive to be common. These habits were rare, almost impossible to find naturally, and the man in the car knew exactly what they meant. Then, one evening, just as the young man returned home from another long run, he found an envelope resting neatly against his doorframe. Plain, unmarked, no sender, no seal, no signature. Inside, a single line was written in precise handwriting, calm, certain, almost unsettling. If you wish to see the world as it truly is, follow the instructions inside. The rest of the message contained directions, coordinates, and a time. Curiosity should have made him hesitate, caution should have kept him away. But something deeper stirred within him, a pull he couldn't fully explain. Whether it was instinct, destiny, or the quiet realization that someone had been watching him for a reason, he didn't know. What he did know was that he couldn't ignore the letter, so he followed the instructions.
They led him beyond the city limits, down a road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the countryside, until he reached a nondescript building hidden behind tall, unmarked gates. No signs, no guards in sight, only a dim entrance, partially open, as if waiting for him. He paused for a long moment at the threshold. The choice laid before him was as heavy as it was irreversible. Yet something within him, an instinct sharper than fear, pushed him onward. He crossed the threshold, and in that single step, he left behind the ordinary world he had always known and entered another entirely, one that very few ever see, and even fewer ever leave.
Days folded into weeks, and the weeks stretched into long, disciplined months. Time inside the facility moved differently, quieter, heavier, stripped of ordinary rhythm. Training was never just about strength or endurance. It was a complete reconstruction of perception, a dismantling of who he had been, and a careful forging of someone entirely new. He learned to study people in ways he never imagined. The subtle tension in a stranger's shoulders became a story he could read at a glance. A shifting weight, a tightened jaw, an involuntary twitch, each sign revealed intent before words ever could. Lies no longer belonged to language. They lived in the rhythm of a breath, in the hesitation between blinks, in the slight tremor hidden behind composure. He was taught to track a figure not by sight, but by presence, the faint imprint someone leaves in the air when they move through a space, the almost inaudible changes in airflow, the whisper of fabric brushing against stone. His instructors told him that the world spoke constantly. Most people didn't know how to listen. Nights were the most demanding. Simulated missions unfolded in dimly lit corridors lined with false doors and shifting obstacles. Sometimes the halls were entirely silent. Sometimes they echoed with disembodied sounds meant to unsettle him. Psychological tests pushed him to the edge of fear, patience, and intuition, until every reflex he once relied on had been stripped, broken down, and rebuilt with purpose. Bit by bit, the young man he used to be receded like a shadow at dusk. In his place emerged someone who understood patterns woven into the world, patterns invisible to most, but clear to him as cracks in glass. He could slip into these patterns effortlessly, navigating them until he could vanish within them. That was when they gave him the name. They called him Zigzag, not because he was erratic, but because he embraced unpredictability as a discipline. Every movement he made curved away from expectation, his path bent intentionally, sharp, decisive, impossible to anticipate. No one could follow him for long, and no threat could trace him without losing direction. When the time came to finalize his file, a symbol was placed at the top. A single letter Z, drawn in a harsh, slanted motion, ending in a point as sharp as a blade. It wasn't just an identifier. It was a signature, a declaration of what he had become. His earliest operations were gentle, almost fragile in their subtlety, tasks designed not to test his strength, but to measure the precision of his presence. Watch, report, disappear. These were the simple instructions, spoken with the calm certainty of those who understood that true skill reveals itself in restraint, not force. He moved through cities like a shifting breeze, a quiet whisper carried along the edges of the night wind. No alarms followed him, no second glances trailed behind. He blended into crowds not by shrinking himself, but by becoming the kind of person the human mind instantly discards, a passerby whose details dissolve moments after he steps out of view. A quiet observer,
A pair of footsteps lost among hundreds, a thin, unnoticed line in the background of a larger picture. His reports were immaculate, clean, detailed, never exaggerated. He remembered every doorway, every pause in a stranger's walk, every pattern in a target's routine. But what impressed his handlers far more than his accuracy was his restraint. He never interacted more than necessary. He never lingered. He eliminated nothing unless ordered. He understood intuitively that in the world of shadows, the ones who rush burn out first, and the ones who act before thinking rarely survive long. Rumors of him began to drift quietly through internal channels, first whispered between supervisors, then encoded into classified documents. In briefings held behind sealed doors, a new name was spoken with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. Zigzag. A man who moved without repetition, who never walked the same route twice. A man whose silence had weight, so profound that it felt louder than the world around him. A presence so faint it was almost unreal, yet impossible to ignore once you knew he existed. And so his legend began, quietly, the same way he did everything.
Then came the mission that would shift the entire trajectory of his life, quietly at first, like a faint tremor before an earthquake. It arrived in a sealed black envelope, thicker and heavier than any he had received before, as though even the paper itself carried the weight of what waited inside. The moment he held it, he sensed that this assignment was unlike the others. It did not feel like a task, but a threshold. Inside, the instructions were concise, but the implications were vast. This was no simple surveillance mission, no discreet extraction, no silent reconnaissance. It was infiltration, deep, prolonged, and dangerously delicate. The target was not a person, nor a building, nor even a single organization. It was a sprawling network of misinformation, a vast and shifting architecture of fabricated truths and weaponized narratives capable of destabilizing entire regions. This was not a place one could map. This was not a figure one could shadow. It was a living maze, coiling and uncoiling in real time, a creature made of secrets, whispers, altered data streams, and faces that changed faster than names. Zigzag moved through countries with the ease of someone stepping across tiles on a floor, each border crossed with a new passport, a new accent, a new posture. He slipped through identities like pages being turned in a well-worn book. His shoulders loosened or tensed depending on who he impersonated. His footsteps grew heavy or light. Even the cadence of his breathing shifted, aligning with the environments he passed through. Slow and unhurried in sleepy towns, clipped and sharp in bustling capitals. The deeper he went, the more the mission felt like descending through layers of reality, each one darker, denser, more distorted than the last. Information no longer felt solid. Truth bent and wavered like heat rising from asphalt. People spoke in half-phrases, using coded gestures and smiles that meant nothing and everything at once. But every maze, no matter how cleverly designed, holds its dead ends, and even the most meticulous traveler eventually encounters one. It happened subtly. Perhaps a document was placed a fraction of an inch out of alignment. Perhaps a reflection caught on a camera lens that should have been dead. Perhaps a moment of human fatigue, a blink too long, a breath too quick. Whatever it was, suspicion began as a whisper and then spread like a tightening thread. The labyrinth reacted. Corridors that had always been open suddenly closed. Contacts grew distant or vanished altogether. Patterns he had once navigated with precision twisted into something unfamiliar. And then came the eyes. Eyes he had never noticed before, watching him from doorways, from streets, from the corners of mirrored rooms. They followed him with a patience that felt predatory.
For the first time, the zigzags were no longer enough. The labyrinth had begun to move against him. One cold, brittle morning, so early that even the sun seemed reluctant to rise, his handlers gathered around a secured terminal deep within the facility. Routine protocol, review encrypted transmissions, update threat assessments, scan for anomalies. It was a process they had repeated countless times, a rhythm as familiar as breathing. But this time, the rhythm broke. On one of the intercepted enemy intelligence feeds, a file had appeared. Not fragments, not hints. A complete profile, clean, organized, unmistakably deliberate. Zigzag, laid out in full like a specimen on display. His name, or what remained of it, his secondary aliases, his travel patterns, his recent disguises, his training signatures, every detail pinned to digital screens with surgical precision, each piece of data arranged as though marking the anatomy of a creature finally captured after years of pursuit. For the first time, the world that once failed to trace him had succeeded. A quiet alarm rose not through sound, but through the widening eyes of his handlers, the tightening of their shoulders, the way no one dared to speak. The unthinkable had happened. Someone had pierced the veil he lived behind. The extraction team was sent immediately. No sirens, no rush. It had to be silent, like a final page turned in a story nearing its end. He was intercepted in a narrow corridor of the facility he once thought impenetrable. The lights overhead flickered with the pale hum of early morning power cycles, casting thin shadows along the walls. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no drawn weapons, just the soft echo of footsteps, the brief meeting of eyes, and the nearly inaudible click of a door sealing shut behind him, trapping the cold air inside the room where he now stood alone. Zigzag did not resist. Resistance would have been meaningless, a desperate gesture unworthy of the life he had lived. He understood the nature of his world too well. In his profession, discovery is not an event, it is a verdict. Once identified, the game ends. The story shifts from movement to stillness. Yet even in that quiet, he felt no panic. There was a strange calmness within him, a stillness formed over years of navigating shadows. It was as if he had long understood that the paths woven in darkness rarely lead to gentle conclusions. They twist, they narrow, and eventually they deliver their travelers to the only destination that makes sense. He exhaled once, slow, steady, accepting. It was not defeat, it was recognition. The end had simply arrived.
The courtroom was vast and pale, an echoing chamber washed in a sterile glow that seemed to drain every trace of warmth from the air. Light reflected off the polished marble floors and blank walls, giving the entire room a sense of cold observation, as if the building itself were studying him. He sat alone at the center of it all, not as a criminal bound in shame, but as a solitary figure carved out of silence, a man whose existence had unfolded in the narrow spaces between shadows and secrets. No one in that room knew his real name, nor the dozen other names he had worn like discarded coats throughout the years. They didn't know about the nights he had spent tracing the outlines of invisible threats, stepping quietly through fractured alleys, abandoned train stations, and anonymous apartments, all for people who would never know he existed, let alone what he had done for them. His life was a mosaic of hidden sacrifices, each one carried out with the understanding that recognition was never part of the bargain. He offered no defense.
He revealed no secrets. He spoke only when protocol required it, and even then his answers were delivered with the soft precision of a man accustomed to living without the luxury of truth. Instead, he allowed the reality of his actions, the silent missions, the unrecorded nights, the invisible wars, to linger in the spaces between the prosecutor's questions. Those pauses held more weight than any explanation he could have given. The judgment came swiftly, almost mechanically, as though the outcome had been predetermined long before he ever entered the room. But beyond the courtroom doors, the world would never hear the details. His file was sealed, his record buried beneath layers of clearance, and his story locked inside an archive where only dust and time would ever reach it. Yet even as confinement closed around him, something within him remained unbroken, a quiet conviction, a belief that every path, no matter how winding or treacherous, eventually straightens out into clarity. And in that belief, he found a measure of peace, a final truth that belonged to him alone. When his sentence was finally carried out, there was no spectacle, no dramatic disappearance, no final revelation to satisfy those who had followed his case with morbid curiosity. Instead, he seemed to fade into a kind of deliberate stillness, a quiet dissolving at the edges, as though he were slipping back into the same silence from which he had once emerged. It was the kind of exit that felt almost intentional, crafted with the same precision he had applied to every step of his clandestine life. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. Some whispered that he had been quietly relocated under a new identity, buried within a remote program designed for operatives too valuable to discard but too compromised to remain visible. Others believed he had been permanently erased by the same security apparatus he once served, his existence reduced to a single line in a classified archive, inaccessible and unread. Yet there were other stories, softer, stranger, spoken only in confidence. A few claimed that a man bearing his unmistakable mannerisms had been spotted jogging before dawn in a distant, fog-covered city. He moved the way he always had, lightly, deliberately, scanning his environment without seeming to look, adjusting his pace with the subtle caution of someone who trusts nothing, not even the rhythm of his own footsteps. It was as if a shadow had learned to breathe, retracing its steps through a world that had already declared him gone. Like a line that bends and twists, vanishes into obscurity, and then, without warning, reappears far from where anyone expects.
The zigzag continues somewhere